Hi, Jeff. How are you doing?
Very good. How are you doing, Gary?
I'm all right. I'm all right.
Nice to see you, by the
Yep.
way. And
You as well.
and first of all, as always, I just want to tell you what a huge impact you continue to have on my spiritual well-being. I find your books fascinating and amazing. And I'm
Yeah.
currently reading The Secret Teachers of the Western World
Oh, okay.
and simultaneously A Secret History and Consciousness.
A lot of secrets.
Yeah, that's which is perfect because that will lead into
Yeah.
today's conversation. So
Right.
our upcoming issue is it's magic, mysticism, and the paranormal. And
Right.
I wanted to speak with you because I guess a couple of years ago now I had read Dark Star Rising,
Mm.
and I found that to be a very eye-opening book because me, like most people, I think of magic as something that used to happen in the Middle Ages or something that is practiced on the fringes of society. I'm a believer in magic. It's not that I don't believe that it exists, but what I didn't realize is that the way that you're thinking about magic and what you're seeing shows that magic is a very prominent part of the modern world, much more so than probably most people, certainly I was thinking. And so I guess, first of all, Gary, what I'd love to have you do is define magic for us, because I know that's been such a big part of your practice.
Well, I mean, I don't know, magic. Aleister Crowley famously said it was the art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. And then Dion Fortune sort of changed that a bit to changes in consciousness with conformity of will. But I mean, just, overall, I would say magic is the belief that through certain, rituals, certain practices, the mind alone basically can somehow either alter reality or make contact with agencies that can do that. I guess that's, traditional magic is carried out by the spirits or demons or whatever, you can conjure those. Then I guess there's a natural magic if someone has some kind of inner, like Rasputin, okay, he could heal and things of that sort. So, but I think in the context that you started talking about it and talking about my book, Dark Star Rising, Magik and Power in the Age of Trump. The central idea behind that book, even though Trump is kind of the figure, he's kind of a linchpin, is that I thought we entered a time in which, from a variety of different avenues, the notion of a stable, objective, reality that is there, and it's something cut off from us. I can't, no matter how hard I think and try, I can't, make something happen in the world, which is basically, I would say, the fundamental idea about magic. That from a variety of different ways, that idea is, as you said, is usually on the fringes, on the margins, or it's from the before time, our deluded ancestors believed in something like that. But it seemed to me that it was dead center. It had come in from the cold, as it were, into kind of the center of action. And there are a couple of reasons for that. I mean, said around Trump, he himself is a devotee of positive thinking. And he was schooled in the ideas of Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote this very, very influential book in the 50s, The Power of Positive Thinking, which is more or less a kind of Christianized version of a magical notion or mental science and new thought, that thoughts are things, and you can use the mind alone to, so Trump was brought up on that. And then there's reports that at the time, his sort of followers, the alt-right, who nobody ever hears about anymore. I mean, they were in the news for quite some time, but you never hear about them anymore. They were supposedly somehow using magic on the internet to help him get elected. And this was a form of chaos magic. And by saying this, I don't in any way want to stigmatize or associate any chaos magicians out there with, either the alt-right or Trump, but it did seem to be they were in some way using this, and this had to do with, using the internet and posting these memes strangely enough, about Pepe the Frog, which is a whole strange story, which I don't know if I want to go into. That's a weirdness. But so that they're supposed to be doing this. Trump is practicing positive thinking. And then the whole cultural context in which this is taking place is one in which, from both the academic world and the world of popular culture, this notion of reality being unreal or up for grabs or malleable, that's the common kind of idea. It's just sort of accepted. Postmodernism. You said magic in the modern world, but it's more, I would say, magic in the postmodern world. And even now in the post-everything world where we are, we seem to want to jettison everything, from the past. No, this notion that reality with the capital R, truth with the capital T, we've come to understand it doesn't really exist in the way that we thought. And even in science and all this, with quantum physics, where, uncertainty principle and indeterminacy and all this different ways. And then in popular culture, the most popular thing for the last several decades is what? Reality TV. And so the representation of reality has seemed to have taken over from the actual reality itself. So that was a long-winded way of saying that magic seems to have come into the center because of all these other things that have taken place that have basically created a kind of cultural space or mental space, or whatever you want to call it, belief space in which it seems to be, yes, this can be true. And also, we live in a time of conspiracy theories where there's less and less faith is put into, the authorities and what they say.
Right. Very interesting. So I guess what I would like to ask you, because what I found fascinating is, of course, as you said, the central figure of your book happens to be Trump, but the book expands all around that. And you said that in politics on all sides, magic is being utilized. And I assume by that you mean consciously utilized, not just people are using magic without knowing it's magic. They're actually consciously using it. And I wanted you to differentiate, because some of the power of positive thinking, I wouldn't have thought of it as magic before I read your book. I would have thought of it as more like psychological influence, or so I wouldn't have quite given it magic. But when I read your book, I thought, it's really magic. I mean, it's not just changing my attitude and therefore better things happen because I have a better attitude. It's actually having some direct influence on reality.
I was going to say, and one of the things I show in the book is that there's a lot of similarity between positive thinking and the aims and approach of chaos magic. Again, not to stigmatize chaos magic, but they're both positive thinking, it's a realizable wish, and in chaos magic, it's an achievable reality. So they're goal oriented. They both want to make something happen. And on the chaos magic side, that's a reversion back to the old idea of magic. Chaos magic, as far as I understand, starts up in the sort of mid-70s here in London, around the same time that punk starts going. And like punk, it's a DIY kind of magic. It's a do-it-yourself magic, like punk was do-it-yourself music. But they were tired of if you know the magic in the late 19th, early 20th century, it's the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and it's much more of a mystical kind of approach. It's about having the knowledge and conversation of your holy guardian angel, which is like your higher self or your true self, or whatever variants on that. And they were like, no, we're tired of all that. We want stuff to happen. I want money to come in the mail, or I don't like my neighbor, or whatever. You know what I mean? That they wanted to change things, and it's the same thing with positive thinking. I mean, Peele. He was schooled in all these older New Thought, like Ernest Holmes and Ralph Waldo Trine. And, New Thought goes back to Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American essayist. He coined the phrase. And then William James, the great American philosopher and psychologist and early, explorer into mystical states and so on, he was very much behind it too, in the sense that he understood that, he couldn't understand exactly why, but it did have this effect on the whole, as you said, it's more health oriented then. In the early days, it later got into the prosperity kind of gospel. But no, it's all about sort of focusing. You make a mental image of something that you want to happen, and it needs to be something that could happen, not like something that is impossible, but something that could happen through normal means. It's just that right now something's in the way, and there's problems. And then you think, and you focus on that, and then you think it down into your unconscious, and then it's somehow the idea is that you act as if it's already taken place. And so this is like you're affecting the reality out there.
So are you familiar with Neville Goddard?
I know who he is. The expert on that is a fellow named Mitch Horowitz, who's written quite a bit about Goddard, and he's kind of sort of been a one-man kind of revival for his work, putting out lots of stuff. But I mentioned him in Dark Star, because again, he's someone that is kind of sort of on the, I don't want to say he's kind of on the edge of sort of the New Thought prosperity, but he also gets into a bit more deeper kind of waters.
Yes.
That to me cross over into someone like, I mentioned the magician and artist Austin Spare in the early 20th century. It's kind of contemporary Crowley. But he's kind of seen as a kind of early proponent of this chaos magic stuff, which ties into what
right. I have a feeling I probably got into Neville Goddard after I read your book, because I don't know where I would have heard it. It's fairly recently that I heard of him, and then I started reading his writing, and there was one story that he tells about someone who was a mentor of his, and he said he wanted to go on this trip somewhere, and he didn't have money, and he couldn't possibly afford it, and then the whole story is this mentor says, okay, just know that it's already happened, and then forget about it,
Right.
And then there's a whole turn of events, and he's almost going to go, and then he can't go, then he's almost going to
go. Yeah.
The last minute he can go,
Yeah.
Very compelling. And then he goes back to his mentor and he said, it worked. I knew it was going to happen, and it happened. And the teacher said, it worked because I had faith, not you. And it really struck me, the ending of the story, because that guy never had faith. He never thought it was going to work all the way to the end. But I started to realize that I tend to think of these things as, okay, like even The Secret, they're so popular.
Right. Yeah.
You put these things in your mind, and because you're holding them in mind, like you're saying, you're thinking about it, unconsciously that is affecting what you do, and therefore you will end up creating the thing that you are implanting. But when I was reading Neville Goddard, and when I read your book, I started to want to think of it just in terms of magic, like not in terms of kind of an unconscious intention that becomes manifest because it is working on my psychology, but as some kind of intention that gets implanted in reality, and then reality conforms to that intention. And the more that I've thought about it that way, the more I've seen, the more I believe it actually works that way. And it's a fascinating shift for me.
I mean, when you asked earlier about my definition of magic, I mean, what I should have said, and I say in the book, it's induced synchronicity. Jung's notion of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. Something very important is going on in your life, in your head, and then you suddenly see something out in the world that is exactly lined up with it. And so to you, so obviously and unmistakably meaningful that it seems like, well, someone or something is aware of what, it's that kind of striking kind of thing. And magic, I would say, is somehow it's a way of making those things happen. I mean, Jung didn't like the idea that we could somehow make them happen. Because it sounded too much like magic to him. And throughout his career, he wanted to maintain that he was a doctor, professor, scientist, and not that, although everyone knew that he was, and we all know now. But so he's, in the early days of kind of trying to associate synchronicity with quantum physics and all this kind of stuff, and it's actually kind of a muddle. I mean, I'm a great fan of Jung, and his work has informed and inspired me no end. But at the same time, when he tries to explain synchronicity in these kind of scientific terms, it gets a bit muddled. But that's what it seems to me. And say someone like say Aleister Crowley, he was kind of hit and miss, because sometimes it worked, a lot of times it didn't. But I think he somehow knew some way to throw himself into the unconscious, as it were, and stuff would pop. Things would kind of happen, and maybe what he wanted to happen would be one of those things. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like that, but that's fundamentally it. I would say you induce synchronicities in some way.
Fascinating. So you just mentioned Aleister Crowley, and I have not actually read your book yet on him, although it's on my shelf.
One of the millions.
He's an interesting character because I'm trying to publish, and I don't know if I'll be able to, but I want to publish the letters between Aleister Crowley and Fernando Pessoa. Because
wow, okay.
A favorite poet of mine, and I am friends with a Pessoa scholar who's been translating and looking into some of Pessoa's esoteric works. So, and I think that story is in some book of yours that I read.
Well, it's in my book about Crowley, and also I write about Pessoa in a book called what's called The Dark Muse in the States. Here it's the Daedalus Book of the Occult, A Dark Muse, and it's about writers in the occult. And actually, I went to the Book of the Inferno, with the mouth of hell, outside of Lisbon, where Crowley was, faked to suicide. And there's a plaque there, that talks about, and I mean, I know someone who was working on one of the, funnily enough, I started reading this stuff a long, long time ago, and then it dawned on me at one point, it's like all this academic, there's all these Crowley studies. So I know someone who's like, working on that. But no, that sounds fascinating. Then I guess they must be in English, right? Because
they are.
Pessoa was a linguist, and I don't know if Crowley wasn't bad himself, but I don't think he knew Portuguese. But
no, they corresponded in English around astrology and esoteric.
Right. Yeah. No, fascinating.
Time Pessoa was also writing in Portuguese a lot of sort of essays on esoterica.
Oh yeah. Well, he had this whole the sort of esoteric history of Portugal, and its kind of destiny in the world, and this kind of thing. It was no, he's a fascinating character. In some ways, he and Crowley share other things. They were both chess players. He was a much better poet than Crowley was. But also he created all these heteronyms, right. these other characters, and Crowley throughout his career was always adopting. Although it was always Crowley in disguise, but right. He was always adopting all these, like he's the the mad Arab or something, or whatever, Prince Chauha Khan and all this sort of thing. So
he was quite a character. And
absolutely.
And so in terms of Crowley, he's kind of your introduction to magic, years ago, I guess, probably in the 80s.
70s.
70s. The band Blondie?
Yeah, a long time ago.
You guys were playing in clubs like CBGB in New York, and you were also getting into magic. Aleister Crowley. Can you set the stage for that?
Well, that happened. Yeah, that happened when I started playing in Blondie in spring of 1975, and I was all of 19, and we at one point moved into a loft space on the Bowery in New York, which back in the day really was the Bowery. It really was the end of the road. You go there now, it's completely unrecognizable, overpriced places, except the place where we lived. That still looks like a dump. So I always think that's a good sign somehow. Yeah, it's But in this loft space, there was this very flamboyant artist who sort of rented us off our floor, and he was into Crowley. And I didn't know any of this stuff. Didn't have any interest in it. And the only kind of occult and supernatural, this was like horror stories, H.P. Lovecraft and stuff like that. I read a lot. I had read Jung, and I read Hesse and Nietzsche, but I really wasn't into the occult at all. But he was this fascinating kind of character there, and then he would do these impromptu readings, and he painted these canvases based on Crowley's tarot deck, and copies of books like Diary of a Drug Fiend were lying around. And that's the gateway drug, gateway drug. There you go. Gateway book. If you're interested in drugs, you read that one, and then, oh yeah, I'm into magic because he's totally, up my alley there. But then I also read another book just called The Occult. And this was by Colin Wilson, a British writer who's had the most influence on me. I mean, I wouldn't be living here in England. I wouldn't have written books I've written if it wasn't for him. What was fascinating about his book, and I just said that I had read Nietzsche and Hesse and stuff, is that he looked at the history of the occult in terms of a philosophy of consciousness that he had been working on already for the past decade and a half. I didn't know about. He started in the 50s. His first book was The Outsider, and it's all about this, the stress and strain of alienated creative individuals in the world without meaning, and it's people like Nietzsche and Sartre and Dostoevsky and all this kind of stuff. But he's talking about consciousness in the context of this kind of philosophy, and he's just such a wonderful writer. So I was just carried away by it, got completely enthusiastic, and I just started reading, and one of the things out of that was reading about the paranormal as well, everything. And that was a great time to do this because the bookshops there were so many like classic books that were kind of public domain, so cheap reprints, and they were in the cutout bins anyway. So even I, who was starving as a wannabe rocker, this is before Blondie became famous and all that. I could afford these books, and I wrote a song called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear," that came out here a few years later, and was a big hit in the UK and Europe, and it was about this telepathy and shared dreams I was having with my girlfriend at the time. So you can say all the stuff I'm doing now, or have been doing for the last 20-something years, started, back then.
Fascinating. So every time I talk to you, Gary, I think I need to go to London and spend like a week with you. Because everything you say leads me to topics I want to talk to you about. So the hardest thing, of course, is staying on track. But that's fascinating because Collin Wilson is someone who's been in and out of my orbit, and I'm very fascinated, but I haven't quite gotten deep into him yet. So I'm fascinated to hear that.
Let's go. You have something to look forward to. He's compulsively readable. I find myself rereading books of his that I've read I don't know how many times, just because of his voice and how readable he is.
That's and did you write a book about Colin?
I eventually wrote a book about he died in 2013.
Okay.
He was 81, I think, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe 82, somewhere around there. And it was after that I wrote a book called Beyond the Robot: The Life and Work of Colin Wilson. And the robot is sort of a kind of symbol for what all of his work is about. Mm-hmm. And it's like Gurdjieff says, and like many other people say, we sort of, we live in a kind of half sleep. And in terms of Colin's ideas, it's because we unconsciously give over a lot of our experience to what he calls the robot. The robot is a handy, absolutely necessary evolutionary labor-saving device that allows us to pass over repetitive actions so that we can, if I'm typing something, I don't have to learn how to type every time I go do it. After years of doing it, my fingers know how to do it, and I can think about, what I want to say, like you drive a car, play a musical instrument, anything like that. So we wouldn't be able to do anything if we didn't have this robot. But what happens is, through a series of misunderstandings and evolutionary mistakes, we've allowed it to do more than it should. It does its job too well. Mm-hmm. So it does things that we'd rather do ourselves. You're probably not of an age, but when I was a kid growing up in the 60s, there was an advertisement on TV for some aspirin or something. And there was a woman whose mother was always, doing things for her. And she was saying, "Mother, I'd rather do it myself." And no, don't take 2 of these. And she would calm down. But that's exactly, we've allowed the robot to do. It looks at the sun, it smells the air, makes love to our, whatever partners, it listens to great music, when we'd rather do it ourselves. Right. And on these off moments when either it's put to sleep a bit or is taking a break, or somehow we are more present, we feel more alive. and that's because we, the actual me and you, are enjoying our experience. We're not allowing this, and you have to remember the robot isn't a villain. It's some that we can't live without it.
Right.
But we have to be able to learn. In Colin's work, that sounds very simple, but it's also about this one thing he says: the paradoxical nature of freedom. And this is the funny thing, that when our freedom is threatened, we know exactly what it is, and we know how important it is, and we'll fight tooth and nail to the end for it. But once we've secured it, after a little while, unconsciously, we lose that vividness of it, and we sink back, and we even get to a point where we feel it's a burden.
Mm-hmm.
What am I going to do? I got a couple hours to kill. Jesus, that kind of thing. That's the robot, said, you don't have to do anything. I'll take care of everything. And meanwhile, life becomes kind of dull. So somehow crisis is one of the things that jolts us out of that. And we sort of recognize, okay, this is more important. I have to do this myself. And this is why all these outsider characters that he writes about, they go and do crazy things.
That's awesome. Oh, good. I'm looking forward to getting into that.
Yeah.
And I want to ask one last question to finish up our interview here. Because I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I wanted to find out, so there's a bunch of people in the world who are interested in magic, right? They like magic and they're interested, and they're going to pursue it. But for the rest of us who maybe haven't been into magic or have seen it as something either from the back or something on the front, why should those people start to take an interest in magic? Why should they start to be interested?
Well, I would say it's not so much you should take an interest in magic per se, as perhaps try to understand the notion that there isn't this impermeable barrier between what goes on in here and what goes on out there. Like, that film, unlike Vegas, what happens in the mind doesn't necessarily stay there, right? And again, this is the whole notion of the new thought and a variety of different things, And in my books, I show from different people's work and putting them together how this notion of an absolute separation between the inner and the outer is a relatively new development in consciousness. And at an earlier time, it was less so. It was more participatory nature of consciousness. There's a fellow named Owen Barfield who writes about that quite a bit. And he's not that well known, but he was a great friend of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and he was a follower of Rudolf Steiner. But he wrote quite a bit showing how history of language shows us that at an earlier time, the kind of rigid separation between inner and outer didn't exist. And hence, earlier language is more poetic, it's more figurative, and then we have all the myths and reports of, spirits and fairies and things of that sort. So one of the things I think that may be happening is whether we like it or not, that, how should we say it? That separation, either it's breaking down, or another way of seeing is that somehow it's I don't know how to say it. I mean, as I said, we talked about synchronicities. There's a variety of different ways in which you can understand how it's not this. It doesn't mean that, it's hard to say, because we get into these sort of metaphysical kind of phenomenological waters where inner and outer all start to lose the very sharp, definitions. And we don't have a language. We've been talking about Pessoa and poetry. And poetry can somehow show us this stuff, but we've yet to develop a kind of discursive language to talk about it without getting into contradictions and all that.
Right. But, and I guess what you're talking about is the kind of partial dissolution of inner and outer, also has a parallel in the partial dissolution between fiction and fact.
Well, exactly, absolutely. That's one of the points I make in the book, is that, the whole notion of, well, I have tongue-in-cheek say that, what happened is that we put so much reality into the television. We put so much reality into the means of representing reality that something popped out. And Trump was what popped out, because he started out as reality TV. Well, not started out, but he was, a reality TV star that programmed The Apprentice. And if you look at that show, it's very much he's being primed for the role of being president. He wears the power suit, he hires and fires, he's magnanimous and generous, he's cruel and ruthless. He's the leader. And I make a reference in the book to a book that came out in the 1940s called From Caligari to Hitler by a fellow named Siegfried Kracauer. He's a great German, social scientist. But if you know all these early films, pre-National Socialist films in Germany, like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or M, that made Peter Lorre famous, Metropolis. There are all these films where you have this kind of big leader in the background. Another one is these crime films, Dr. Mabuse. English speakers don't know as well, but in German, he's like, like a famous bad guy, a famous supervillain. And these films all show there's some kind of, Mr. X or Mr. Big in the background, calling the shots and manipulating things. And Krakauer argued that this primed the German public for Hitler, the Fuhrer to come and all that kind of thing. So I don't want to, make that analogy too strong, but there is a notion in which Trump's career readied him for what he was doing. And when I heard that he had put his hat in the ring, as they say, I thought he's going to get elected, just because nothing made more sense than to have a reality TV star become president of the United States. It sounds like a reality TV show itself, And so there's like all this enfolding, and again, that's the postmodernism thing too, where they say the spectacle, it's the age of the spectacle. It's taken over. What we see has taken over from the actual reality.
Yes. And I love what you're saying. And some of what you've just talked about is, you could say that the sort of negative manifestations of fact and fiction breaking down.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's not necessarily a good thing. By in and of it, neither is magic necessarily a good thing, or the imagination in and of itself. It's a power.
The flip side is that I think it is a good thing, because I think we have surrendered to a reality that's beyond our control. We've surrendered to being victimized by the idea of a reality that is enforced or inflicted on us. And the breaking down of inner and outer fact and fiction, although it has negative manifestations, of course, it also, I think, allows us to realize, because the first time you and I met, the only time we've met in person, was because you did a talk with my former teacher in London. And so I'm coming from a non-dual tradition. And in a non-dual tradition, one interpretation would be that there is no distinction between inner and outer, because that would And so this, I find it fascinating that the ways in which you talk about magic, I think can lead to a kind of awakening to the oneness of reality, and the fact that inner and outer may be perceptual differences that are real differences, but they aren't sort of ontologically, existentially, there's no actual clear borderline between those two. And I think that can be a huge awakening for people.
Mm-hmm. No, I know that part of your former kind of work involved the work of Jean Gebser, the philosopher, and he talks about the breakdown of the mental rational consciousness structure. And I would say, yeah, he hit it there. That seems to be what's been going on. Mm. So, yeah, I mean, well, this is the thing, it may not be ontologically, experientially, we still feel the difference between inner and outer. So phenomenologically, which is, I try to stay within that. Like, okay, what is, I don't know if it's real or it's not real. I don't know if it's inner or it's outer, but it's like this. This is what it's like. Sort of, when, insofar as I can, recount the experience. To me, it's important to realize, like I said, we're not just passive reflections of reality. And this is sort of the Cartesian notion that, there's a independent whatever out there, and the mind is a reflection of it. And the phenomenological, which Collin Wilson came out of that tradition a lot, and this goes back to a real straightforward, button-down, here, Dr. Professor, philosopher Edmund Husserl. But his fundamental idea was that perception is intentional. There's an intent. We're not immediately aware that we're making some kind of fundamental effort to perceive the world, but it's going on in some way. So it's not a passive reflection. It's a reaching out in some way. And so if that's the case, we don't create reality, but we certainly have a hand involved in the way the reality that we do see looks. You know, we pick and choose and all that kind of thing. And again, when synchronicities happen, do I somehow make it happen, even though I'm not voluntarily trying to make it happen, or somehow am I funneled through a series of, you know, situations to arrive somewhere where that is taking place? It's hard to really think about how, you know, because some of the ones I have, in fact, that's the next book that's coming out. I'll give a plug. It's coming out next year, and it's called Dreaming Ahead of Time.
Oh, nice.
It's about my experiences with precognitive dreams, but also with synchronicities and coincidences, and it looks at all of those kinds of things. And I mean, I've recounted somewhere, it's just like, someone would have written this in a book, but how this could possibly been arranged. Because it would mean somebody getting on a bus at a certain time to make sure they would get off the bus there, and then I would have to just be sitting there, even though I wasn't really waiting for the bus, you know. And oh yeah, that happens. Well, who knew in advance? So all those kind of things come in, you know.
That's amazing. By the way, do you know Jeffrey Kripal?
Yeah. We've met and corresponded.
Oh, good.
No, fascinating. He's written many fascinating books.
Yeah. So you and he are like way top on my list of I don't know what heroes, I suppose. But yeah, I guess the thing that I feel, and I'm feeling talking to you, what I felt in your book is, because I don't know what's real. I don't know what reality is. I don't know how it works. But I think it's very important that we have the capacity to question what we think is real.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I feel like the way you speak about magic opened a different door for me to question unconscious assumptions about what was real and what was possible. That forced me to have to admit that I don't really know.
Well, that is the beginning of wisdom, my son, right? Isn't it? You know, that's we don't know, you know, we can start maybe to put a couple things together. But as I said, I just think it seemed to me right now, so many things have come together that suggest that. And on top of that, we have all climate change, whatever you want to call it, all the other, you know, the physical crises out in the world. So we have an ontological crisis, we have epistemological crises. We don't know what to know anymore. I mean, basically, if the government says it, it's wrong. So that's why there's so many, you know, conspiracy theories about all this stuff. Right. And again, you know, there's a positive, creative, necessary skepticism, but then there's a skepticism that it just opens one trapdoor after the other. That's right. And you're constantly falling through. So Gebser said we had to go through this. He talked about the equivalent of the dark night of the soul in some way.
Okay.
A variety of other people. I wrote an article last year during the first lockdown here about H.G. Wells, who everyone knows, you know, The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, but he wrote many books about social philosophy and what was coming in on its way and anticipations. And he saw pretty much everything that we're going through coming at least 100 years ago. And so people have been aware of it's the acceleration of change. That's an easy way to say it, but like change happens, but it happens at an increasing kind of rate. And we're so used to things changing overnight.